We'll try to understand data type concept. Just for practice of JIT, maintaining a server-side repository, how do you maintain the repository? For the purpose, I'm giving this. Okay. Fine. Let me go with the data types and variables. So what is a variable? What is the purpose of a variable? And what is a data type? Now look at this. I have a memory. Now I have memory. I am saving the data. I have some memory location and I was saving the data. Now I have a data called Satish. This is the data. In that memory, some data is stored. I have a memory location where my data is saved. I have a memory location where my data is saved. Now, when the data is saved in the memory location, how do you refer to this data? When data is saved in the memory location, how do you refer to this data? If I want to refer to this data, for this memory location, we are giving a name. What is that name called? Branch. Branch is the name given to this memory location. In that location, some value is stored. Branch is the name given to the memory location where I was able to store the data. Now I have the name. I gave college name. I have student name. I have fees. So what are these? These are the variables. What do you mean by variable? Name given to a memory location where we can store the data, perform the changes as per your requirement. Variable is a name given to a memory location where we can store the data, perform the changes whenever it is necessary. Variable is the name given to a memory location where we can store the data, perform the changes whenever it is necessary. So that's called variables. Now fee is a variable, student name is a variable, college name is a variable, branch is a variable. It is referring to a memory. In the memory, I can put CBAT, later on I can put MGAT, later on I can keep VBAT. Doesn't matter. Because as a memory, I can keep changing my value. I am not referring to the value, I am referring to the memory. In the memory, whatever the value was there, that value I will refer. So in that memory, I can keep changing my value. So variable is the name given to a temporary memory location where we can store the data, perform the changes whenever it is necessary. So what is that fee? It is a variable. Branch, variable. College name, variable. Student name, variable. I hope you are good. It is a name given to a memory location. In this location, we can store the data, perform changes based on it. It is a name given to a memory location. In this location, we can store the data and perform the changes based on requirement. Right. But the definition of the variable is not answering three questions. What is that? It told Name given to a memory location. How much memory was that? We don't know. Stores the data. How much amount of data is stored? What type of data is stored? What is the maximum value? What is the minimum value? Now I told it is a name given to a memory location. In this, okay, how much amount of memory was that? It stores data. What type of data? Is it a decimal, integer, date? What type of data? Perform the changes based on requirement. What is the maximum value it can store? What is the minimum value it can store? So the ranges are not given. To answer this, we have a next definition, which is called data type. We have definition called data type. So when I say variable, it's only it is a variable. EMP name, salary, age, ACC. These are the variable names. It says it's a name given to a memory location. What is that memory? How are you giving? What type of data is stored? We are not sure. These are variable names. Then we have a concept of data type. What is this data type? Data type will tell you. Data type will tell you how much amount of memory, this will specify how much amount of memory is given, how much memory is given for a variable, what type of data is stored in a variable, what is the range of the data, this will specify how much memory is given for a variable, what type of data is stored in a variable, what is the range of the data that is stored in a variable. Data type will tell you how much amount of memory is given to a variable, what type of data is stored in a variable, what is the range of the data that can be stored in a variable. Data types in the Salesforce. Data type in the Salesforce is classified primitive data types, collections, objects, objects created for Salesforce defined Apex classes, primitive data types, objects created for Salesforce defined Apex classes, objects created for user defined Apex classes, this is a way of getting. Data types in the Salesforce is classified as a primitive data types, collections, as objects created for Salesforce defined Apex classes, objects created for user defined Apex classes. These are the different type of data types what we have in Salesforce. First, let us start with primitive data types. What are these primitive data types? What we are going to use? First primitive data type we have is blob. Now, if you want to store any image, PDF file, Word document, any audio, video, what will happen? Data will be converted into binary format. If the file occupies more size, like your images, okay, your documents, PDF files, Word document, or any file which takes more space, they are converted into blob. They are converted in the form of binary format. So what is that blob? Binary format. It is used to load encrypted data while you are using a web services. Let us say you want some data to be securely saved. Now you have a web page, username, password, and you're submitting. When you're entering the username, password, and submitting, it has to go to the ICICI. Now, how securely this data can go to ICICI Bank from your Salesforce? Now, what will happen? Whatever the username, password is there, that is encrypted and that will be sent. Now, if you encrypt, how the data will be saved? In the form of binary. Now, if you save the data, I want to encrypt the data and send it. So, if you want to encrypt the data, it will be saved in the form of binary. If you want to load any image, binary. If you want to upload any PDF or Word documents, it will be saved in the form of binary. The files which occupy more space or which you want to encrypt, they will be stored in the form of binary format. So if you want to store such type of data, data type is what? Blob. So what is a blob? It is a collection of binary data under one object. It is a collection of binary data under one object. It is used to store encrypted data or PDFs, documents, images. Default value is null. If you don't define anything, default value is null. The next data type we have Boolean. What is the purpose of Boolean? It will store true or false. When I say Boolean, this will store true or false. Boolean. It will store true or false. Default value is then we have date. This will store the instance of a date. This will store the instance of a date. Today's date is referred system dot. If you want to refer to particular date, date dot new instance of date dot new instance of year, month, day. Date type. Date. It is going to create an instance of a particular date. Date type. If you want to refer to a date, along with the time. Current time, referred as. It is not system dot now, system dot today. If you want to date along with the time. This will store instance of a particular type. New instance of this will refer to the instance of a particular type. Time dot new instance of hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. This will refer to instance of a particular type. That is hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. All these are data types. You want to store encrypted data, blob, boolean value, date value, date and time value, type. Next we have integer.
Is there any meaning for the primitive data types?
Which are defined by this compiler. Which are defined by the compiler. Primitives are defined by the compiler. Non-primitives are defined by users. Now, whenever I say primitive, they will store data. Non-primitive will store address. Whenever I say primitive, they will store data. Whenever I say non-primitive, they will store location. Primitive will store data, non-primitive will store address. Primitive are created by the compiler. Non-primitive, we have to create a memory and okay, let's not make complex here. Primitive means they will hold the data, as simple as that. Okay, look at the point. I have a, whenever you are trying to store any numerical value, whenever we are trying to store a numerical value, whenever we are trying to store a numerical value, look at the point. Always, while storing the numerical value, last position is meant for sign of the number. I give a reverse actually. Always, last position is meant for sign of the number. Okay. Now, how many bits are left for the storing the data? 3 bits. What is the maximum value we can store? 1. So this is nothing but 2 to the power of 0. So what is the maximum value? 4, 2, which is coming as 7. So what is the maximum value we can store? 7 is the maximum value what we can store. So if we are using 3 bits for storing the data, what is the maximum value? So which I can give it as 2 to the power of 3. If 3 bits are used for storing the data, 2 to the power of 3 minus 1. What is that? 8 minus 1, 7. So what is the maximum data we can store? How many bits are used to store the data? 2 to the power of those many bits minus 1 is the maximum value what we can store. So if I want to represent 32 bits, 32 bits means what? 1 bit will be left for side. How many bits are left out? 31. So what is the maximum value? 2 to the power of 31 minus 1. If I have 64 bits, 1 bit is left for sign, 63. 2 to the power of 63 minus 1. I hope you are good. Clear for everyone? Right, boss? So 1 bit is used for representing the sign. Remaining bits are used for storing the data. So 2 to the power of 63 minus 1. This is how we are storing it. Come back. Integer. (32 bit). It is a 32 bit numerical value. It is used to store numerical value without decimal. It is used to store numerical value without decimal point. It is a 32 bit number. It is used to store numerical value without decimal point. Default value is null. In all the cases, default value will be null. I guess. What is the default value? Then we have next one, long. Next one we have long. What is long? Long is a 64 bit number. So whenever we want to store value more than 2 to the power of 23 minus 1, 2 to the power of 31 minus 1, if I want to store the value log, okay, more than this. If I want to stay, okay, store the value larger than this, I will go for long. Long is a 64 bit number. It is used to store the numerical value without default value is null. Next we have decimal. Now it is a 32 bit number. It is used to store numerical value with or without decimal. Default value, by default currency fields, default value is null. Double. See, 64-bit number. Is used to store default value is null. So we have integer, long, decimal, double. Then we have string. It is a collection of characters surrounded by symbols. Default value is null. Then we have ID. What is this ID? This will store any valid 18 character record ID created by Salesforce. Default value. Every record will have a default ID, right? The IDs will be stored. Last one we have object. This will store any type of data that is supported by default value is null. So this is the basic definitions of these data types. Let us see where we are going to use them. These are the basic data types that are used by the Salesforce. Now let us use them. Let us use them. Right. Look at the format. I have some data like this.
Lower data type, sorry, primitive data types will write in lower case, right?
Let me finish first. Okay. Let's not deviate. Right. Now we have this. What is the type of value? What is the data type we prefer here? Decimal. Now what is the data type here? If you ask anything other than digits, any value other than digits, any value formed other than digits, by default it's going to be Hyderabad. What is the value here? ICICI 001. Is it only digits or combination of digits with alphabets? So what is the data type here? Now, is it only digits or combination of digits with other symbols? Now we have hyphen 040 hyphen 1234. So it is what? Now what was this? Integer. What was this? Plus 9100. Okay. Is it a string or integer? This string. Now what is this? This. Then I told 2018. So this is. Are you getting my point? Based on the data, we will decide a data type. First, we need to understand what is the format of the data we are getting. Now, if the data is in this format, what is the data type? If the data is in this format, what is the data type? Now, I want to collect the data about a student. Then I want to create. Which info you want? Value, the data type, variable name. I ask you to collect name. Name is going to be like Satish. It's going to ask you to collect age, something like this. Then we have city. This is how we got. Now, what is the data type we prefer? Variable name, I told. So, string is the data type. What is the variable name? Age. Integer. Hyderabad. Now, you need to understand what is the format of the data. Then only we have to go for data type. All the variables will be in lower camel. So, a string or integer. Why? We have this. Email. Fee. Experience. This is going to be date. So, when I say experience, somebody may take 3, somebody may take 4.5. Now, how can you say it's a decimal or integer? Now, you should ask, what are the possible values we may get? The people say 1, 2, 3, 4 like this we are going to get, I will go with integer. If the people say we may get 3.2, 4.3 like this, I will go with the decimal. Now, you should know what is the format of the data we are getting. Based on the format only, we can decide what is the data type, what is the variable. Are you clear? Data type should be created based on the value what we are going to store. Data type should be created based on the value what we are going to store. I hope you are clear. Product info. Now, my product name, let us say Dell. Now, create the data type and variables now. Create the data type and variables. Create the data type. Create on the book. Put on the paper.
So this you have stopped?
Come again.
Okay.
Can I ask one doubt?
Yeah, go ahead, Abba.
Suppose the values will be changed, right, in between string to decimal or decimal to string. So that time, what we have to
No,
take?
it won't be. The data type will be a fixed one. Then if you are not sure about what value we are going to have, if you are not sure about what value we are going to have, then we are supposed to go with object. Then we are supposed to go with a concept called object.
Yes, it is done.
String. Then we have what is the format of this data? So this is how we are going to create. So your data type is decided based on the data what we are taking. Now, if the data is sometimes you may get the data as 3, sometimes as 3.2, then I have to go for decimal. Decimal can accommodate integer value. Integer cannot accommodate decimal values. Right, boss? I hope this is clear. Clear? Right? Which data type you take for what? Am I clear with this? Price? Yeah. Now, look at the format. I have integer, long, integer value can be stored in long values can be stored in decimal value can be stored in double. Reverse is not accepted. Integer can be stored in long can be stored in decimal can be stored in the double. Okay. Now if I give accepted, right? But I cannot give integer values can be stored in long values can be stored in decimal values can be stored in double. But double values cannot be stored in decimal values cannot be stored in long, decimal values cannot be stored in integer. Are you clear? So integer is small, next followed by long, followed by decimal, followed by double. So which is having highest position? Double. So in the double what I can store? Integer value, long value, decimal value. In the decimal what I can store? Integer value, long value. In the long what I can store? Integer value. Integer, only integer value. I hope you are clear. Clear? Right. So if you have a question mark whether you are going to get a decimal or not a decimal, then take a decimal. When you have a question mark, sometimes you may get 3, sometimes you may get 3.5. You have the question mark, take decimal. No, you are sure that it is going to be integer, take integer. No, some value will be decimal, some value will be integer, take a decimal. I hope you are clear with this. Clear? Okay. So how you create a variable now? How the variables
Satish, I
are?
have one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, decimal is a 64-bit, right?
Decimal
And
is
long is,
long is
sorry,
60.
decimal is 32, right?
Wait for a minute. 32. But the way they are represented is different format. The data will be
Oh,
stored here IEEE 786 Mantissa. Now in your BTech you might have studied Mantissa exponent format. Right? The Mantissa exponent format is used here because of which decimal can store larger value than, even though long is 64-bit, but decimal is 32-bit. Still decimal can store large amount of data because internally how the data is stored, it is stored in the form of IEEE 786 Mantissa exponent format. Right? Let us not get too technical
okay.
into this.
Sure, sure.
Right. So how the variables are defined here? Data type, variable equal to value. Equal to value is an option. So I can define integer is or else I can string. If I want, I can also give value. This is how we have created. Right. So we can define it. Either we can define the values at the time of declaring the variable, or later on we can assign it. It's up to your choice. I hope you are good with this. So variables specify that they are referring to a location where we can put the value. Pardon me? If you want to take more than 32-bit value, you go for this long. Okay. Simply larger value, we go with double. Right, boss. Okay. Now I hope you got my clarity. Variable data type. Variable data type. Now non-primitive. Other than primitive, anything that you define is a non-primitive. I give account ACC. Now Now all these are what? Non-primitive. Other than primitive, whatever you take is a non-primitive. Other than primitive, whatever you take is a non-primitive. If the data type is other than primitive, account is not a primitive data type. Contact is not a primitive data type. List of account is not a primitive data type. List of integer is not a primitive data type. Other than primitive data type, if you take any other data type, it is what? Non-primitive. Other than primitive data type, anything else you define is a non-primitive. Other than primitive data type, any other data type you take, it is a non-primitive. I hope you are good with this. Clear for everyone? Clear? Now, look at the point. Scope. What is the scope? Now we are going with the next one. What is the next one we have? We have scope. What is the scope? This floor braces is called scope braces. Now, if so, all these statements are a part of scope. We are giving if was this scope of for wherever we write a floor bracket, it's a scope. This is considered as scope of wherever we write floor bracket, it's a scope. So wherever we are going to write floor bracket, it's a scope. I hope you are good with this. Wherever we write a floor bracket, it's a scope. Scope of method, scope of class, scope of interface. Floor bracket means scope. Floor bracket means scope. Floor bracket means scope. I hope you are good. Anything that we write within a floor bracket is a scope. Scope. So if you want to call this scope, how do you call? With this name. If you want to call this scope, how do you call? With this name. If you want to call this scope, how do you call? With this name. If you want to call this scope with this. So for the scope, we are giving a name. For the scope, we are giving a name. If you want to call the scope, we have to use that name. If you want to call the scope, we have to use that name. If you want to call the scope, we have to use that name. I hope you are good. Scope. Floor brackets indicate scope. Scope of method. Scope of if. Scope of for. Scope of class. I hope you are good with this. Right? Okay. Now, how do you print the values? Look at the format. Next. Here we have local variables, global variables. Next we have local variables, global variables. Local variables, global variables. Local variables, global variables. Now, look at the format. How many of you know this Srinivas boss? How many of you know this Srinivas? Is my colony president. Does anybody know this Srinivas? No, right? So this guy is known only within my colony. If you come out of my colony and say is Srinivas, nobody will recognize. If you come out of my colony or community location and say that you are Srinivas, nobody will recognize. Nobody will recognize. So he was known only within their colony. Right? Now if you say KCR boss, what is that? This guy is known outside my colony, inside my colony. Now what was this? Srinivas local, KCR was a global. Global can be used within the local, outside the local. Local can be used only within the local. Local can be used only within the local. Local can be used only within the local. Are you getting my point? Local, global. Any variable you define within the scope. Any variable you define within the scope is a local variable. Any variable you define outside the scope is called global variable. Local variables cannot be used outside the scope. Global variables can be used inside the scope and outside the scope. Are you getting my point? So let us give basic information. Any variable defined within the scope are called local variables of the scope. Local variables can be used only within their scope. Local variables can be used only within their scope. They cannot be accessed. Local variables cannot be accessed outside the scope. Global variables. Any variable defined outside the scope outside the scope are called global variables. Global variables can be accessed within the scope. Global variables can be accessed within the scope and outside the scope. Now, if you look at this, now what are the variables defined? Defined means these are the variables. We are using this variable, but where are these variables defined? Defined outside used inside. Now these are the variables defined inside. Defined inside. Any variable defined. If you define data type and variable, then it is called local. This is what? Using the variable. If we use, it is not a local. If you define, it's a local. Okay. Now what are the local variables here? Local variables, branch, global variables, let me give you another. This is what we got. Now tell me, for the show, what are the local variables? In the show, what are the local variables? Branch. Right. Then what are the global variables? Name, phone. What about this string rating? This is local to call me. I cannot use this within show. Variable defined within the scope is a local to the scope only. This variable is defined within this. So it can be used only within this. Call me. Local is rating. Global. Global. We have the global as name, phone. Are you getting? Within the floor bracket, if you define, they are local. Within the floor bracket, if you define means data type variable. All these are what? Using. They are not defined, they are used. It is defined, it is used. Are you clear about it? If you define, it's called local. If you define, it's called local. Are you clear about this? Local. Any variable defined within the scope is called local. Any variable defined outside the scope is called global. I hope you are good. Clear for everyone? So any variable defined within the scope is called local. Any variable which is defined outside the scope is called global. Yes. We can define it. Okay. Right. So this format. People can copy this URL, boss. You can access the material from this URL. github.com/sfdcguru/batch317. You can access the notes from here. SFDC Guru batch 317. github.com the material is available there. Type that URL, collect the material. Right. Chalo, that's all from my end.